and welcome back to the Observations podcast, brought to you by Democracy Volunteers. I'm Ethan Reuter, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about the 1906 general election. I'm delighted to be joined by Taym Saleh, who is a teacher and a published historian in electoral politics. Taym, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to first get into the aftermath of the Boer War and the historical context of the election. How did the Boer War and the moral unease that surrounded it impact us going into 1906?
Well, I suppose the initial phases of the Boer War so dominated the previous election, that is, in the general election of 1900, that it's rather set things up in such a way that it became kind of that as soon as the war moved on to further stages, there would be an inevitable big kind of unwinding effect. What I mean by that is that in the 1900 general election, the Unionists, led by the Conservatives, having already been in power for 5 years, rode a tremendous wave of patriotic, or perhaps more accurately, jingoistic euphoria, when there was an enormous mobilization of public opinion around the justice of the so-called Outlanders cause, those people of British extraction working in the Afrikaner majority South African republics, whose rights and standing was the kind of the initial pretext for British invasion. There was an enormous, as I say, patriotic resurgence and mobilization, which formed the basis for the Conservative landslide victory in 1900. What that meant, though, is that the natural exhaustion that accrues upon any government that's been in office for any considerable period of time, and the considerable and growing uncertainty, especially amongst conservatives, but really throughout British society and throughout the British political class, about what this new century was going to bring for Britain and for Britain as a hegemonic imperial power. All of these sort of deeper issues were sort of foreclosed. They were punted forward into the first decade of the new century by this exceptionally kind of frenetic, febrile patriotism at the time of 1900. So, of course, so what this means is that once that euphoria wears off, and once the initial advances of the British Army degenerate into a pretty ugly counterinsurgency, to use modern terminology, that sees the pioneering of concentration camps and so on. There's not only some revulsion at the moral consequences of that, but there is no longer anything that can really kind of put off or postpone the reckoning with where Britain and British commercial and political power stands in the world as it is going into the 1900s. I think that's the real significance of the Boer War effects unwinding.
And moving from economic issues into more religious ideas and positions of the nonconformists, how does the Education Act affect the already described Conservative dominance in the previous election? How did those transform Conservative fortunes?
Well, it is the fallout from the Education Act becomes a sort of harbinger of a much more severe series of divisions that I'm sure we'll talk about more soon regarding protectionism and tariff reform, because the Boer War effect that we were just discussing had the effect of perilously dividing the Liberal Party and rejuvenatingly uniting the Unionists or the Conservative Party. And so Unionists were divided into basically pro-war and anti-war camps. At the time, it would have been called, the pro-Boers. That was sort of the almost the slander that was put at the feet of the anti-war camp. And the Conservatives had this very uncomplicated thing around which to rally, namely the flag and the army. But something like the Education Act has the opposite effect, at least on the Liberal Party. What the Education Act did, the premise of it was that going into the 20th century, what had previously been a very fragmented and rather unsystematic system of arranging primary and secondary education, particularly in England and Wales, needed a revamp, right? And in sort of setting the administrative ground for this systematization, the Conservative government decided to resolve certain long-standing kind of issues or ambiguities in the education system concerning the role of religious education or religious instruction in schools in favor of the Church of England. In other words, to close down some of the opt-outs that religious minorities had in areas where they were quite a small minority. This has the effect of taking the Liberal Party away from a very uncomfortable terrain, which was what to do in the face of this jingoistic euphoria that we just talked about, transports them well into their comfort zone, namely defending the principles of religious liberty, defending freedom of conscience, defending the rights of religious minorities. One has to understand that the Liberal Party in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was really the kind of the creature of particular, one might call them interest groups or demographic groups, and perhaps in some ways the morally most potent of those were the Protestant nonconformists. So members of Protestant churches outside the Church of England. So by which I mean Baptists, Congregationalists, Methodists. Not quite Methodists are quite an interesting denominational category in this period. They're beginning to behave more and more like nonconformists and less like the Anglicans they originally were. But the point is that the tabling of the Education Act puts the Liberals on a much sort of firmer footing and lets them rehearse and regurgitate some of the slogans and ideas and arguments that virtually all Liberals, whatever they thought about South Africa, whatever they thought about the British Empire, whatever they think about the future of the British Empire, can all agree that freedom of conscience is good and that church privilege is bad and that the Tories are bad. And that's a very straightforward series of things that they can hammer away at.
From putting the Liberals back on track, what do I mean when I talk about the Taff Vale judgment in relation to the 1906 general election?
The Taff Vale case, which was decided at the House of Lords in 1901, was a legal dispute over what should happen legally in the aftermath of a strike, of industrial action. Specifically, when a strike in an industry causes businessmen, the owners of capital in those industries, to suffer often very severe financial losses, are trade unions liable for those losses in law?
Mm-hmm.
The Taff Vale judgment said that they were, and therefore this created a new legal status quo where striking, the right to strike having been effectively more or less enshrined in English laws on a statutory basis in 1875, where striking effectively the de facto ability or legality of striking is put back on the table. This has a potent effect, which in the first instance is straightforwardly good for the Liberal Party. The second instance, a bit more ambiguous. In the first instance, it puts a real kibosh on any complacency or any willingness to accommodate on the part of the unionized working class towards the Conservative Party. And it provides a powerful reminder of why the enfranchised, politically organized, trade union joining working class should have a powerful preference for the Liberal Party over the Conservative Party, since the Liberal Party goes into the 1906 election promising to introduce legislation to effectively repeal the consequences of the court ruling of Taff Vale. The longer-term consequence, however, is that it puts the questions of capital versus labour to the fore of British politics. And that is not something that the Liberal Party can permanently feel as comfortable assuming in terms of political positioning as they could for things like the Education Act or things like tariff reform. And this creates, of course, most perhaps mentally of all, the context and the climate in which trade unions and other radical associations or groups can begin to think about forming a quite new political organization.
Talking of trade unions and their relative political organizations, I want to get slightly more into the politics pre-election. The Liberals and the Labour Party form an electoral pact between MacDonald and Gladstone. What impact does this have going into 1906?
Well, the Gladstone-MacDonald Pact is, it does, in the short term, looking specifically at the 1906 elections, it does a very important thing. So Ramsay MacDonald, on behalf of the newly founded Labour Representation Committee, soon to be called the Labour Party, which was this new organisation that I mentioned a moment ago, makes an agreement with Herbert Gladstone, so that's the son of the former Prime Minister William Gladstone, who is at this point the chief whip of the Liberal Party, where they effectively agree not to fight against each other so far as possible in as many constituencies as possible. So in other words, to foreclose the possibility that there will be a split in the anti-Conservative votes, which might allow the Conservative candidates in through the middle, a split between a Liberal candidate and a Labour candidate. So on the one hand, this cuts off from the Conservatives a possible reprieve from the electoral dangers that are facing them. It makes the landslide defeat that is coming all the more punishing in terms of seats lost. On the other hand, the Liberal Party, in making this pact, is acknowledging that this new party can't just be squashed out of existence, nor can the Liberal Party be confident enough, even though in many other ways it has the wind behind it to do with education and divisions within the Conservative Party, we'll talk about in a bit. Despite that, the Liberal Party is not in a strong or confident enough position just to simply squash this upstart political force. This is a force that clearly has to be accommodated. Now, in the 1900s, that accommodation does not do the Liberal Party immediately any harm. As we said, it's a good way of doing over the Conservatives. But what becomes apparent as we go further into the future is that this new force, in the first instance accommodated, has this vital breathing space electorally in which it can secure, with a tacit liberal blessing, in the first instance about 24 seats in the 1906 election, about 40 seats 4 years later in 1910. And of course, once the First World War comes and does what it does to the Liberal Party, then really, from the Liberal Party's point of view, all bets are off. So the MacDonald-Gladstone Pact, in other words, is a really good way of sticking it to the Tories from the Liberal point of view, but marks the entrenchment on the electoral scene of a very dangerous political force for the Liberal Party.
Certainly. And what seems, and we'll get into the impacts potentially that it is to come, as you've already mentioned, but whilst researching and whilst reading this, there is the resignation of Balfour and the seismic moment that seems to be, at least for what is current British politics, if we had a leader resign a few months before. Can you talk about the political implications and the strategy of a Prime Minister resigning prior to an election?
Yeah, this is for modern audience, for modern observers, a really peculiar thing, right? To have the government change hands before the election instead of right after it. This is, I'm quite sure the last time this happened This was not an uncommon practice, where even though on paper, the party which Balfour was leading still had a very healthy majority in the House of Commons, Balfour understands perfectly clearly, as does everyone, that an election has to come soon, and we're talking now that sort of the late autumn or mid autumn of 1905. An election has to come at some point in the next 12 months. There is no longer any real prospect of things being turned around. The name of the game for the Conservatives is damage limitation. Damage limitation, especially over the divisions that had been plaguing them for the previous 3 years or 2 years about tariff reform. The only hope of mitigation, really, that the Conservatives have is if they relieve themselves of the strains of government, because, of course, it is in government that these strains are the most visible, because you have it in your power and your responsibility to actually govern and do things. The hope then is that by relieving the Conservatives of this burden, and by placing that burden onto the Liberal Party, it might perhaps be the turn of the Liberal Party to have some of their own decisions to make once they're around the cabinet table. So as a result, knowing that all he's doing is foregoing an extra couple of months or maybe a little bit more of time in government, which showed no signs of being particularly productive anyway, Balfour tries to sort of slightly make the best of a bad situation and decide that since there has to be an election anyway, there might yet be some succour for the Conservatives gain by placing the strains of government onto the shoulders of the Liberal Party. So that's why he resigns, knowing an election is coming up, rather than waiting for the election to throw him out.
And with the starting context covered, I want to get into some of the leadership profiles that we see of the main parties, not only Sir Alfred Balfour, but Henry Campbell Bannerman, Chamberlain and Keir Hardie. What were their leadership styles and their temperament as leaders going into 1906, and how did that affect the election?
Well, starting with Balfour, everything that everyone sort of has said about him, especially before he became Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, is that he was a strikingly erudite, intelligent, rather bookish politician, rather by the standards of politicians, even at that time. His intellect, undoubtedly first class. He was the nephew of his predecessor as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, Lord Salisbury, who retires in 1902. So there is a sort of succession within the family, and there's maybe a lingering sense. Although Balfour had won his spurs as a cabinet minister in the 1890s, it's still the case that this sort of family succession has, is a sign that this is someone who is Balfour is someone who has not risen to the top by a superabundance of grit or political having borne political scars or anything like that. Once he becomes Prime Minister, he finds himself for most of his time in power in a rather in a pretty unenviable situation, which is to very self-consciously be the presiding moderates, presiding over two competing factions who are kind of claiming to be competing for his support. But he knows he cannot ever give that support decisively to one side or the other, because it will cause the spurned side to leave. And therefore, he can never resolve the dispute by actually throwing his weight behind one side. So this internecine strife within the party has to go on and on and on, and he has to carry on playing this role of being the chairman of this very fractious board. And performing this role just kind of consumes everything, and there's not really very much else that he can do. All he can do is from day to day firefight the consequences of this logic that he is trapped in. He's doomed. The only person who can resolve the Tory civil war is him, and he can't resolve it, because as soon as the civil war is resolved, the fallout from that resolution would be a full-out split in the party. So that's the sort of the very ugly trap politically that Balfour is in. As for Henry Campbell Bannerman, he's rather been perhaps unfairly forgotten, given that he, due to ill health, relinquishes the premiership within 2 years of winning it at the general election, or just before the general election. And has been therefore kind of blotted out from memory by his sort of vastly more sort of full of character figures like Asquith and David Lloyd George. Campbell Bannerman himself was an eminently experienced Commons man. He was, if not the only party leader and prime minister ever, then must be one of very few to have been party leader and prime minister whilst also being the father of the House of Commons. He'd sat without interruption as an MP since 1868. He had not entirely dissimilar to Balfour, in opposition at the time of the Boer War, had to live with the similar internecine strife within the Liberal Party regarding attitudes to the Boer War. And it helped that he wasn't sufficiently committed as a partisan to either side of that fight between the so-called pro-Boers on one side and the so-called liberal imperialists on the other, such that when the political debate moved on away from those peculiar conditions of 1900 that we were talking about earlier, he was in quite a good position to win the allegiance of both the radical anti-imperialists, non-imperialists, and the liberal imperialists. So he, having started in a position kind of like Balfour, found himself in a much more comfortable position because of the way in which the political climate had changed after the election of 1900. Joseph Chamberlain, despite not being the party leader, at least of the Conservative Party, was in a sense much the more mesmerizing figure, more than either of the official party leaders going to this election that we've already discussed. Peter Marsh, one of Chamberlain's biographers, titles his biography "The Entrepreneur in Politics," and I think that's a pretty good way of describing him. Not only because he himself was a businessman before entering politics, he was a man of trade. He was a Unitarian autodidact who made it big in the industrial scene in Birmingham. But his career, once he enters national politics in the 1870s, right through to this period of the 1906 election, seems determined with almost every passing political moment of dominating the political scene and in an attempt to continually reshape the future of British politics through his interventions. The first one is his first incarnation of the particular kind of big government radical. So when he first comes on the scene in the 1870s, he's known in the first instance as someone who had made it big in local government as the mayor of Birmingham, and as someone who, as the person who ran municipal politics in Birmingham, was associated with this particular notion of government intervention in social and economic questions called gas and water socialism, whereby municipal government can be a vehicle to represent local political consensuses, which can be used to carry out the kinds of interventions for social matters that we would nowadays tend to associate with national government. So to do with the provision of various amenities, to do with poverty reduction, and so on. So that's his first brand in the 70s, early 80s. And this looks like being the future of liberal radicalism, or radical liberalism, I should say. Then in 1886, crucial moment, should home rule, what we would nowadays call devolution, be granted to Ireland? Ireland at this point being in its entirety a part of the United Kingdom. Chamberlain, along with quite a number of other Liberal MPs, says to William Gladstone, the champion of Irish home rule, no. In so doing, he quite crucially changes the character of what this new party called the Liberal Unionist Party. So the Liberals, those Liberals who do not want to grant home rule to Ireland. Without Chamberlain, there's a danger that liberal unionism comes across as basically a Whig or an anti-radical throwback, where Irish Home Rule is just the pretext for various anti-radicals, people, to use modern parlance, on the right of the Liberal Party, who are already uncomfortable with the populist direction that Gladstone has taken them in, and is just using this as a rather useful pretext. Chamberlain is meant to be the most avant-garde, or among the most avant-garde of the radicals. And so him joining the unionist camp really changes what liberal unionism looks like and what kind of challenge it is putting to the rest of the Liberal Party. And then when very quickly, almost immediately, this new Liberal Unionist Party forms an electoral alliance that becomes an enduring union with the Conservatives. That's why until now I've been referring to the Conservatives often as the Unionist Party, because that tends to be how they were referred to in ordinary political parlance at this time. Chamberlain opens for the Conservatives, his new allies, this range of possibilities, it's the ways in which, firstly, to appeal to the working class, ways in which to reconcile a support for private property, which is the kind of thing that Lord Salisbury, as leader of the Conservatives, is very keen on, with an appeal to the newly enfranchised working class. Then finally, moving into the 1900s, the next phase of the Chamberlain, the next incarnation of Chamberlain, is as the arch-imperialist. So going back to the 1890s, he plays a role in South Africa in trying to agitate between the Cape Colony, the British possession in South Africa, and the Boer republics in the Orange Free State. So he plays quite a big role in the events that lead up to the Boer War. And then finally, in the 1900s itself, with the Boer War fading into acrimony, his kind of refinement on this sort of radical, big government, imperialist, patriotic kind of tribunism is protection, is an assault on the holiest of sacred cows in kind of the long ideological legacy of British Victorian liberalism, which is free trade, the idea that British industrial domination was secured by offering no impediments whatsoever to the exchange of goods and capital between Britain and her possessions vis-a-vis and the rest of the world. And to question this nowadays, this seems like a pretty dry, kind of pretty technocratic thing. Maybe we get the faintest of faint hints of the intellectual, political, even emotional power this issue had with some of the arguments in America this year regarding Trump's embrace of tariffs. But that does not really do justice. It's just how strongly people felt, especially on the liberal side of politics, about free trade and what the stakes were when Joseph Chamberlain starts to say free trade is something that needs to be revisited. Finally, Keir Hardie. We're talking about someone whose name has obviously achieved a kind of immortality as the founding father of the Labour Party. He passes from the political scene in 1914, just as the event that would go on indirectly to catapult the Labour Party above the Liberal Party, namely the First World War, just as that comes on. And so that has the effect of leaving Hardie as a kind of a relic. His contemporary Ramsay MacDonald, who would go on in the 20s, of course, to become the first ever Labour Prime Minister, is a figure who straddles this period much more fully, and is therefore kind of contains the paradoxes of sort of these two different ages intermingling. Hardie, however, is much more straightforwardly a product of late 19th century Victorian radicalism. So, of course, he's the leader of this new trade union, working class focused movement. But he is also someone who holds a lot of the shibboleths of, as I said, late Victorian radicalism. He is into teetotalism. He is into the principle of home rule for both Ireland and Scotland. Um, and he seems to see in home rule that the promise of freeing from the clutches of oligarchic Toryism, this sort of way of doing local government that perhaps an Irish self-governing body and a Scottish self-governing body would represent. So Hardy's is uh, not just an uncomplicated kind of retread of just like a prototype forerunner of Nye Bevan or Mustache Clement Attlee or Ernest Bevan or anyone like that from the sort of mid 20th century Labour Party that makes it probably a lot more sense to us. Here Hardy is altogether of a quite older turn of mind.
And I want to now look at the campaign. We've touched on the idea that tariff reform and free trade dominates the election. Specifically, an incredibly domestic item, which is loaves of bread, comes up. How does this impact and transform the campaign?
Well, it really gets to the heart of why exactly, we've alluded to it a couple of times, what exactly is it about the idea of sticking some protective tariffs on certain imports? What is it about this idea that is so incendiary? The first thing to say to get to this mystery is, as always in politics, people tend to fight the last war. People have the positions they do, make the arguments that they do with reference to what they remember, what they think they remember. And so when it comes to protective tariffs, especially the idea of having protective tariffs on foreign imports of foodstuffs, this is important because Britain is not self-sufficient in terms of producing its own food. Apart from anything else, the 1870s sees a ferocious agricultural depression that really exposes the logic of free trade. It exposes the agricultural sector to the logic of free trade. And not only is there a general economic downturn in the 1870s, but there's a sort of a perfect storm. You have the general economic downturn. You also have the arrival into British and European food markets, food imports from the New World. Partly this is to do with big technological changes. So the enormous agricultural wheat-growing hinterlands of the American Midwest are plugged into the world economy with the advent of the railroad, linking the hinterland with the East Coast. You have refrigeration, which means it's possible to import meat from Argentina or even Australia and a bit later on, New Zealand. And so you have, for the first time, farm laborers in East Anglia or the West Country or wherever, fully being exposed to the reality of living, of being participants in a global market where you are in a position to be very, very ruthlessly undercut. So the point is that by the turn of the century, any idea that Britain is self-sufficient in food is gone. This means that Britain is a big net importer of food. That means that if you put a system of tariffs, that will inevitably include putting tariffs on food imports, which means, of course, making food more expensive. Now, obviously, in no regime of democratic politics is this going to go down well as an idea in itself. This the repulsiveness of this idea is given extra life by the thing I mentioned a second ago, which is memory. The item of memory that is resorted to again and again by liberals campaigning against what Chamberlain calls tariff reform, or introducing protective tariffs, is the memory of the hungry 40s. So the last time that we had a regime of protective tariffs on food was the era of the Corn Laws, which was ended in 1846 by the then Conservative Prime Minister Robert Peel. And for his pains, he and his cabinet colleagues who supported him were kicked out of the Conservative Party. And so the splits going on in the 1900s feel like an eerie repetition of the splits of the 1840s. So for many working class voters, what had previously been a 60-year-old piece of historical memory, the hungry 40s, the dear loaf, looked like being resurrected. In terms of the embodiment of this idea in the image of or the reality of an actual loaf of bread, this is there are attempts on both sides to play this. Famously, Joseph Chamberlain, when sort of evangelizing for the cause of protective tariffs, appears before an audience with two loaves of bread, which look more or less similar in size to each other. And he says, well, one of these loaves of bread has a certain amount of flour. The other loaf of bread has a slightly smaller amount of flour, reflecting the increased cost that would be borne by protective tariffs. But as you can see, it doesn't really make that much difference. The two loaves are more or less similar. And insofar as there is a diminution, it's a price worth paying to secure our industries and to make the British Empire a cohesive economic unit, and so on and so forth. The Liberal Party, having a much more straightforward pitch to make, which is that expense is bad when food gets more expensive, is able to harp on the idea of the dear loaf. And they're also, interestingly, able to bring in some other little bits of imagery. In a lot of the discourse around Britain's commercial and imperial future at the turn of the century, the points of reference increasingly are the United States and even more so Germany. Both saw enormous resurgences in economic and military might in the closing decades of the 19th century. Both reliant on models of political economy which have protective tariffs pretty close to their core operating procedures. In the case of Germany, there's this added thing which is already becoming apparent by the mid-1900s about this looming crisis of European diplomacy that we know would explode in 1914. But even in 1903, 1904, going into the 1906 election, part of the stock imagery of anti-protection or of anti-protective tariffs is the idea that not only is a cheap loaf better than a dear loaf, but that the way in which workers and the poor in a country like Germany, which does rely on protective tariffs, the way they make their ends meet is by having the quality of their foodstuffs pretty systematically adulterated to kind of meet the costs of importing foreign foodstuffs. So you get all kinds of things of bread made with flour interleaving with sawdust. You have the horse meat sausage, which becomes a real staple of barnstorming kind of liberal rhetoric in the constituencies. And so the politics of food, even at the most kind of visceral visual level, kind of really indicates just what the stakes of the tariff issue and the free trade issue felt like to voters, especially poor voters for whom this was really a matter of subsistence going into the 1906 election. Kind of tells you why it really does loom as the single dominating issue that sort of sets the course for everything else that happens in this election.
Certainly. And I'd also be remiss when talking about the campaign, not to mention a slightly less whimsical issue from loaves of bread into Chinese slavery and the mention of that amongst the electorate and the election campaign. What is talked about, what do we mean when we say Chinese slavery?
Right. So basically, this is kind of most fundamentally connected to something that is a feature of the political economy of the British Empire ever since the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. Namely, that in the absence of chattel slavery, any shortfalls or demands for labor, for cheap, easily exploited labor, in various parts of the empire, cannot be met by outright slavery because that's been abolished. So must be met by some kind of contractual arrangement that would fall short of enslaving people. So you have, for example, which is why, for instance, to this day, there are parts of the Caribbean world where there are there's a significant Indian population. So in Guyana, to a lesser extent, Trinidad and Tobago, that is why the island of Fiji today has Hindi as one of its official languages. Why there was a considerable Indian population in East Africa. So you have this movement of labor of different ethnicities who are kind of under the carapace of the British Empire, moving about very considerable distances from one part of the British sphere of influence to the other. South Africa presents a particular case. South Africa, of course, at the heart of so much that happens, particularly the Boer War, is the mineral wealth upon which South Africa sits, as it still does to this day, particularly, of course, gold and diamonds. After the conclusion of the Boer War, economic production can continue, having been interrupted by the war. But more than that, the formerly independent Boer republics, which had attracted some Anglo-Saxon or ethnic British labor, who had provided the pretext for the Boer War, are now exposed to a much more thorough infusion of British capital to exploit these mineral deposits. And the labor hunger vastly outstrips whatever can be secured in South Africa itself. And so, where you have, at the turn of the century, big sort of pools of, to be very blunt about it, surplus labor, you have capitalists in South Africa who are willing to move heaven and earth to match up the surplus labor with the sort of the arenas for surplus extraction. And at the turn of the century, for various reasons, partly to do with their exclusion from the west coast of America in the previous decade, you have a surplus of Chinese labor who can be procured. So there's part of a story, but there's something additional here because this does become an issue on the radical left of the Liberal Party, and it looms quite large in liberal rhetoric. And that's, again, to go back to the Boer War and to point out that the Boer, part of what was so corrosive about the Boer War in British politics was that it provoked an enormous flowering of what we would now call anti-imperialist critique of how this kind of foreign policy is being conducted and whose interests it really serves. The British Empire was, of course, by no means newly invented in 1899 or 1900, but previously the wars on the periphery of the British Empire were of an altogether more modest scale compared to what happens in South Africa. In South Africa, the cause of expanding the borders of the British Empire draws in the resources of the metropole to a quite unprecedented extent. And this understandably leads people in the metropole to cast an ever more scrutinizing eye as to why exactly this is all happening and whom does it really benefit. And so along pretty similar lines to a contemporaneous analysis by Lenin on imperialism as the final stage of capitalism, you have the radical liberal J.A. Hobson writing about why it is that entire governments, the government of the most powerful country in the world, can be dragooned to serve the interests of financiers and of mine owners in places of South Africa. And this very small coterie of people are capable of exercising such influence upon the political institutions and, what's more sinister, the passions of the people themselves, to subscribe to this expedition and this adventure where you go around, you have concentration camps, you slaughter people wantonly, you mistreat women and children in these hideous ways, and then to cap it off, after you've won, you ship in these indentured Chinese laborers who look for all the world like a dressed up form of slavery. And so what's telling about the role that the so-called Chinese slavery issue has in the 1906 election is that once the business of maintaining the empire starts to become a taxing enough endeavor that it really has to intrude on the consciousness of kind of day-to-day politics in Britain, that's when the critiques come up, not in the era of much sort of more placid kind of complacency in the middle of the 19th century, where these things, for the most part, did not intrude. And individual colonial ventures could operate more or less autonomously without tens of thousands of men having to be raised up and sent to the other end of the world.
And I want to now get into the actual results that we see post-campaign, post-context. What actually do the polls decide?
Well, the verdict of the electorate is pretty unambiguous, that the Conservative Party, having won a majority of 150 odd seats 6 years previously in 1900, are reduced to a pretty miserable rump of 157 seats. Until last year, that was the lowest ever tally the Conservative Party had won. And the spoils fall obviously to the Liberal Party as the new government. The Liberals win just shy of 400 seats, but it's telling that this doesn't entirely fall to the benefit of the Liberal Party. They, of course, get to pick up the prize, the crown of government. We've mentioned the Labour Party. They get 29 seats. That's the effect of the Gladstone-MacDonald Pact. And there are also, at this point, arithmetically not important because the Liberals are in such a strong position, but they'll get their moments in the sun a few years in the future. The sort of the long-standing kind of third force of British politics, which is the Irish Parliamentary Party, which commanded the outside of particular parts of Ulster, the representation almost monopolistically of the remainder of Ireland. So virtually every constituency in Leinster or Munster or Connaught, and a pretty large proportion of the Ulster seats as well, actually, were returned by Irish nationalists. We should say that these were not Republicans. These were not outright separatists. They were calling for a version of the Home Rule vision that Gladstone, a generation previously, 30 or so years previously, 20 years previously, had advanced. And their vision was probably something like in the parlance of the 21st century, we might call Devo Max. It's the idea of like a maximal form of devolution within some basic kind of framework of a United Kingdom with the crown at the head. So because of Home Rule and the prominence that Home Rule had in politics, the Irish Parliamentary Party it's pretty obvious that in any situation where they would become kind of relevant to the arithmetic of the House of Commons in divisions, they were tending to the Liberal side over the Conservative side. So the Conservatives not only 157 only strong, but they everywhere they look, directly across the House, they see the Liberal Party, and then they'd look to perhaps to their left and see an Irish Parliamentary Party, and look further still to see a Liberal Party. So there's really there are no friends, there are no friendly faces to look on when they return to the House of Commons in February 1906.
And with no friendly faces to look around during the House of Commons, was it the Liberals that truly won the election, or was it the Conservatives that lost it, in the way in which political commentators frequently ask?
I don't see much point in straying very far from the cliche of it being governments that lose elections rather than oppositions that win it. I think that's usually a pretty sound piece of analysis, and I think it applies to this. That the Conservative Party, on kind of allowing itself to kind of embark on this tariff reform odyssey, where you have the sort of the true true believer Chamberlainites who buy into the whole idea lock, stock, and barrel. And you have the so-called free fooders who see this as political suicide and is a pretty fundamental breach with a very salutary political consensus. And then you have the halfway house crowd in the middle, led by Balfour, desperately trying not to alienate either side. That this is, that this is a pretty sorry way in which to approach a general election campaign. As I said earlier, the 150 majority which they won in 1900 was always something that flattered them due to the peculiar circumstances, the peculiar political atmosphere at the time that the election was held. The Boer War happened to be in a phase that was conducive to this. And so there was inevitably going to be some kind of snapback. But the scale of the snapback on terrain that was uniquely favorable for recovery of liberal unity. So just like we said earlier, the Education Act had this effect of putting to the foreground questions that every liberal felt very comfortable saying. So similarly, every liberal, whether they're anti-imperialist or not, can they can with complete kind of psychological comfort just talk about the importance of free trade and how this is God, as Cobden said 2 generations earlier, this is God's diplomacy, and this is what made Britain great, and this is like a basic stage in the 19th century of us as a people understanding how political economy really works, to kind of take in and understanding that protective tariffs are just a vehicle for vested interest groups to pervert the workings of the market, depending on how much access they get to the corridors of power. All of this stuff. There's no liberal in the land who doesn't really believe these things and doesn't enjoy saying these things. And so these were conditions perfectly chosen to maximize the comfort of the Liberal Party and the discomforts of the Conservative Party.
And what is the legacy and long-term impacts that we see of the 1906 general election?
Well, in terms of what the Liberal government actually starts to do, in terms of the things that are sort of lasting importance, the Liberal Party, having campaigned on things like free trade, does in office embark on a series of reforms that do look a little bit more adventurous than just kind of banging the drum for free trade. We have the introduction of the old age pension. We have the establishment of the principle of national insurance. We have the provisions of what we would later call something that looks like, free school meals. So we have what liberals for the remainder of the 20th century have always been very proud of describing, which is that the first foundation stones of the welfare state. So that clearly is very important. That the kind of not just the Labour Party, which is at this point still very small, but the entire kind of anti-conservative or non-conservative half of the political spectrum in Britain is committed to statism of some kind or other. That's pretty important. The other thing that's really important about how the Liberal Party goes about office, and this is something that really becomes clear no later than, as like a looming issue, no later than 1908, and then really explodes in 1909, 1910, is the fact that this is the first time, really, that the Liberal Party has won a decisive majority in the House of Commons, while at the same time being in a severe minority in the House of Lords. So until just about going into the 1880s, at the kind of highest level of the British aristocracy, you have the slight paradox that although landowners as a class are Tory and always have been, if you think about the squire and the baronet and the small, the fairly relatively modest landowners dotted around the shires, at the highest level, the real plutocrats, the leader, the patriarchs of like the big families, the duchies, the earldoms, and so on, those who sit in the House of Lords, historically throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, their loyalties were much more evenly divided between the two main parties. such that whenever either party formed a government throughout the 19th century, it was a sort of a completely normal part of a government formation, of cabinet formation, to have something like half the cabinet seats go to members of the Commons and half to go in the Lords, because you will need Lords debates are just as important as Commons debates, and you need to have a strong front bench to make the government's case there. This situation already kind of creaking in the middle, and so the going into the second half of the 19th century collapses with Irish Home Rule. We said earlier there was a split. People like Joseph Chamberlain leave the party over Irish Home Rule. But this becomes an even kind of graver problem when it comes to the issue of how this affects the House of Lords. Because Liberal peers in the House of Lords are overwhelmingly unionist, overwhelmingly against Irish Home Rule. And so an enormous number of them defect. So by the time that happens, you have a tiny rump of kind of loyal Liberals left in the House of Lords. That's in 1886. In 1892, you have a very fragile Liberal minority government, which can't claim much of a mandate. So the fact that it's defeated in the Commons is not terribly important. In the Lords, sorry, is not. It doesn't say that much about the House of Lords. But 1906 is a different story. You have this enormous Liberal landslide. And so the fact that you have this enormous victory granted by the electorate to the Liberal Party in the House of Commons, and they're going to be confronted by an enormous majority of Conservative peers who do not think that the fact that the Liberal Party has won a majority in the House of Commons means that they should cede their power, that they should give way. There's only one way this can end, and that's in the constitutional crisis of 1909-1910. And that's where we get ultimately the 1911 Parliament Act from, which resolves this issue by neutering the legislative power of the House of Lords. So I suppose setting up that constitutional fight in terms of the constitutional history of Britain is also, I think, a really big consequence of the 1906 election.
Thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. If you've enjoyed the flavour of this high-stakes election episode, please do follow us for more and more food-based puns. We're also available on YouTube at The Observations Podcast, and if you're already watching there, please do like, comment, and subscribe. It does greatly help us. Thank you for listening, and thank you for enjoying The Observations Podcast.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.